Research that resonates.
Schweizer has not been wrong on any of his years and years of reporting on the Bidens.
Investigations that matter.
If your last name wasn't Biden, do you think you would have been asked to be on the board of Bureaucracy?
I don't know. Probably not. But that's, I don't think that there's a lot of things that would have happened in my life that if my last name wasn't Biden.
The only entities, the only people that would report on this, and Peter Schweizer, who deserves a Medal of Freedom, in my view.
This is The Drill Down with Peter Schweizer.
Hi, this is Peter Schweizer, and welcome to The Drill Down, where we relentlessly expose cronyism, corruption, and the abuse of power in Washington, D.C. The co-host of this program, Eric Eggers. Eric, how are you?
I'm excellent, Peter. I feel like today's podcast is going to be like one of those Spider-Man memes, when everyone's kind of pointing at each other, because I think our guest, Dr. Mark Moyar, has a lot in common with you.
Oh.
Yeah. With one...
You mean he's good-looking, he's handsome,
I leave that to the people that watch the podcast on YouTube to decide. But I would say, you guys have both written books, and you've both exposed corruption within the U.S. Agency for International Development. The slight difference is that when you expose corruption within USAID, as you did in your book, Clinton Cash, and the way that the Clinton Foundation was partnering with friends of the Clintons and using USAID when Hillary was Secretary of State to kind of make some stuff happen, you became a New York Times bestselling author again. Mm-hmm. Mark Moyar was fired for it. So it's a slight difference in terms of like how things shook out.
Well, joining us today is Professor Mark Moyar. He's the author of a terrific new book, Masters of Corruption: How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency. It's a story about his personal experience as a senior government official who was trying to whistleblow and deal with corruption within the U.S. Agency for International Development. But it's also a broader story of how the deep state, as it's widely known, was used to subvert some of the initiatives of the Trump administration. So, Professor Moyar, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be with you and to be with people who care so much about this critical issue.
So tell us just briefly, set up for us briefly, when you went into the federal government, what your job was there, and then what sort of started to unfold.
Yeah, I joined the Trump administration in February of 2018, and I became the head of what was called the Office of Civilian Military Cooperation, which had about 50 employees, some of them in other countries. And when I got there, I was actually not at all looking for corruption. I was a policy guy and was expecting new policy. But as soon as I got there, I was inundated with complaints from people within my own office that all this rampant corruption was going on. And so we ordered a management review. Although one of the first discouraging signs was when I went and talked to people about this. They said, well, usually managers just kind of ignore this kind of stuff because you create a lot of problems if you start reporting things, and people can lose their jobs. And that wasn't how I was going to do it. So we ordered a management review and found 5 people engaged in various types of waste, fraud, and abuse.
Yeah, you write in the book, which I think it's very well done. It's an interesting, it's an accessible way to highlight a much larger issue. But you write, although U.S. law required all federal employees to report waste, fraud, and abuse to authorities, USAID employees routinely disregarded this law because they either feared retaliation or they wanted to protect cronies. Which was it for you? And I guess as a way maybe to back up, what type of waste, fraud, and abuse did you see first? And then what happened when you began to elevate that issue to others?
There were a variety of types. Some of it was relatively minor stuff, toxic leadership, bullying, people not showing up for work. And that was a pretty widespread problem, especially as there was more telecommuting being involved. The most serious case initially that I came across was one of the people in my office who was actually the deputy to me for a brief time. He was, while serving in the senior government position, was simultaneously the chairman of the board of directors at a company that was getting contracts from USAID and the Department of Defense, which was itself just a massive conflict of interest, and it should never have been allowed to happen. But we also had a guy who was known within the agency as the unethical ethics attorney, Jack Ohlweiler, and he allowed this to happen. But once I actually raised an issue, it went over to the Inspector General, who did an investigation, and this was on the first of several strange engagements with them. But they eventually, after he was on the job for another 10 months or so, they finally gave him the clue that maybe he should move on. And so he ended up escaping punishment by moving to the Department of Defense, and he is actually still employed there today as a senior government official.
So you started reporting what you were being told and what other people had told you and what you were uncovering yourself. What was the retaliation that you started to face? How did they try to say to you, hey, Professor, hey, you should not be raising these issues. We're angry you're raising these issues. What did they try to do to you to silence you?
Yes, well, it actually took several years to get to the bottom of all this, because a number of allegations were made against me behind my back, which I didn't know about until subsequent investigations and freedom of information requests. But we know some people were going to the Inspector General and claiming that I was using too much travel. Now, I did eventually catch wind of this, and the agency made sure I got all the proper permissions. But this is something that is frequently used, especially against Trump appointees, to try to say you're exceeding normal travel. And I was going to Iraq, which costs taxpayers probably more than they should because of what it costs. But the same people who were criticizing me for going to Iraq were going to Vienna and Paris and living it up. So
right, it's not leisure travel to Iraq. I mean,
that's right. Yes, I went to Afghanistan. I went to Somalia, fun places like that. And so that never got anywhere. Those complaints didn't get anywhere. Then someone accused me of misusing my computer at work for private business. They seized my computer, and but that also came up dry. There was no evidence there. Then they accused me of publishing classified information in a book I written 2 years before this called Oppose Any Foe. And that is a bit of an interesting story, but very briefly, I had signed a 30-day non-disclosure agreement with the government earlier on when I'd worked in the special operations world. And I gave them 30 days, and then they kept adding on, and they had over a year to review this book and never did anything about it. And I'm still quite convinced I complied with all the requirements. But then somebody accused me from another agency of publishing classified information in this book. And they used a really devious scheme to do this because they didn't actually provide any supporting evidence. And but then bureaucrats with my agency then said, aha, look, somebody, a senior official at DOD, a 2-star general, has accused one of our employees of this, and we have to take it as gospel. That was what the term they used. Now, 5 years after the fact, I actually have an ongoing lawsuit because the government has done everything possible to try to prevent me from finding out who accused me and what they accused me of, which, of course, violates all of the due process protections that are supposed to be in place.
So I think this is really important because we use phrases like deep state, right? Mm-hmm. And people say, well, what is the deep state? And you kind of get that ethereally this is a threat that there's forces inside the federal government, people that haven't been elected, that kind of make things happen regardless of the leadership that's in place, and that's what Dr. Moyar has experienced. And then we also hear the phrases like the weaponization of the federal government, and that's exactly what happened to him, because just to be clear, what he just said is he wrote a book that came out, I think it was in 2017, and the CIA, if I'm not mistaken, in doing the research, the CIA had like a positive review of the book, and they said it's an important primer. It's like, hey, read this, it's important stuff. And then 2 years later, while he's alleging fraud and abuses happened within the agency he works for, someone else says, oh no, there's classified information there. And so without due process, they then suspended his security clearance, which essentially prevented him from being able to do the job. And that kind of triggers this bureaucratic process that ultimately leads to your dismissal, correct?
Yes, and with these security clearance actions, the agency policy and federal law say you are entitled to due process, which again means you should know who's accusing you, what you're accused of, what the evidence is. You have the opportunity to call witnesses in your favor, but instead some of these bureaucrats who again were in collusion with some of the people I had reported for corruption, they skirt the system. And what they do is they go to a political appointee named Bonnie Glick. And so this is one of the other problems we have in the Trump administration, is that they were not fully prepared to staff the administration at the beginning. And so some people got in who shouldn't have. And Bonnie Glick is the epitome of the Trump person who shouldn't have been there. She was put in the number 2 position at the agency. And at the same time, her husband, whose name is Paul Foldy, was serving as the top lobbyist for the agency's contractors at an organization called the Professional Services Council. Now this, as you guys know better than anyone, is a massive conflict of interest to have the number 2 person in the agency married to the top lobbyist for that agency's contractors. But again, this unethical ethics attorney allows this to happen. And so then they go to her and convince her to fire me, because she, as the agency head, can do that. And she will later say, when she's questioned about that, well, they said that I was certain to lose my clearance, although then later, when pressed by this, the agency backtracked on. They said, well, we weren't sure if he was going to lose his clearance, but because he got fired, we couldn't adjudicate the whole matter. And just a terrible example of how career bureaucrats and malign political appointees work together to facilitate corruption.
By the way, on the lobbyist profile for Paul Foldy, when you go to the Professional Services Council website, they mention that his focus is on the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Oh, they don't even hide it.
No, they don't. They absolutely don't.
Well, what's interesting to me in your story and the example of what you faced is it's the definition of the weaponization of the federal government. And it seems, in a way, similar to some of the things that Trump's faced. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but, this strategy, this approach of we're just going to throw a bunch of stuff against the wall and force them to deal with it. In this way, we can have Dr. Moyar. We can try to besmirch his reputation, right? We can tie him up. He's going to have to spend all this time and energy focused on these minor skirmishes. And so it's going to prevent him from getting things done.
Well, and think about this, too, from a double standard standpoint. What they came after him was, oh, you've disclosed classified information. Think about what we've literally seen in real time. And Dr. Moyar, I'd love your take on this. The discrepancy in terms of how it's handled with Joe Biden's mishandling of classified documents versus Donald Trump. So, this seems to be a weapon that the federal government used, specifically the classified documents. Remember all the Hillary Clinton stuff and the emails? And oh, you mean wipe it with the server? So, and we had military intelligence people reach out to us and it's I would have gone to prison if I'd done what Hillary Clinton did. And so then you see that same trend has continued, and we know about it with Joe Biden and Donald Trump. But just here's a Trump appointee who's been used, who's been accused of mishandling classified information as well.
Yeah, and we've seen this. There are several other cases I mentioned in the book. Adam Lovinger, who reported corruption at the Office of Net Assessment. They revoked his clearance on bogus charges. Katie Arrington and Michael Ellis are other Trump people who were accused of divulging classified information and were deprived access to it. And I contrast those with some of the Biden appointees. Jake Sullivan, who was, had his hands all over the Clinton email scandal, and it was known that he was involved in compromise of classified information. He has no problem getting a security clearance in 2021. Colin Kahl is another one, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, who's accused of posting classified information on Twitter, but he also suffers no punishment and goes in to serve as one of the top positions at the Department of Defense. So clearly, at least in some of these agencies, there's a double standard, and the government's being weaponized selectively against people who are seen as too sympathetic to President Trump.
Well, let's look at another double standard, and that's the double standard of whistleblowers. This is from Real Clear Politics. Susan Crabtree wrote a review of your book. Again, it's a terrific book. I highly recommend people get a copy of it. But here's what she writes, and I think this just nails it. Last summer and into the fall, the whistleblower who reported secondhand Trump's phone call with Ukrainian President Zelensky was shrouded in protections from the intelligence community's inspector general, protections touted by Democrats on Capitol Hill as sacrosanct. During those same months, Mark Moyar, who over the course of several months had reported multiple instances of wrongdoing at USAID, had the opposite experience with his inspector general, who was appointed by President Obama and confirmed in 2015. So it's not only that the handling or alleged mishandling of classified information is handled differently depending on your affiliation. It seems like your whistleblower status is as well. I mean, clearly you were not engaging in behavior that was going to benefit you. You were trying to actually, lo and behold, save taxpayers' money and deal with corruption, unlike the one involving the phone call, which clearly seemed to have some sort of political agenda. And yet he got these whistleblower protections and you did not. Did the Inspector General ever give you an explanation why you were provided no protections as a whistleblower?
Well, we went through several iterations, and one of the most sad things I learned in all of this is how bad some of these inspectors general are. So I later found out that a woman named Robin Marcato had reported the USAID Inspector General to Congress in 2015 that they had been doctoring all sorts of reports to cover up USAID mistakes. And basically the Inspector General was there to protect the agency rather than the whistleblowers. She ends up getting fired, and none of the people who she reports get fired. Inspector General does this, again, phony baloney investigation of her. So then when I go to them, the first thing they say is, you don't qualify for being a whistleblower because we didn't finish adjudicating your security clearance, which is a total fraud of
it's our fault.
Excuse. And,
but you pay the price.
Yes, and this actually, the CIA had used this same argument against one of their whistleblowers, and it eventually got shot down. So then the next thing they said was, well, you are not a whistleblower because you voluntarily resigned. Because, now this again is a fraud. They fired me. I have a termination notice that I still possess. And then 3 days later, at the recommendation of attorney, I submitted a resignation notice because they said that would look better on my permanent record. But there was nothing voluntary about this. So again, they're deliberately misusing the evidence to try to deprive me of whistleblower protections. And then Senator Grassley eventually came out and because they did then a shot of an investigation, a 3-page document that had no evidence collection. And so he finally, after the Susan Crabtree article, went to them and said, this is ridiculous. You need to actually do a real investigation. So then they interview some people, but again, use all sorts of Orwellian logic to try to claim that there was no retaliation. They didn't even look at the source of the accusation against me or the people who I'm pretty sure were linked to it, whose names I had given them. So again, it was clearly this Inspector General just trying to protect the agency and its leaders. And so one of the big things I think needs to be done is to separate the Inspectors General from the agencies, because right now instead of being watchdogs, they're being lapdogs for these agency heads.
Yeah, instead of a watchdog, they're actually colleagues, right? Because you all work for the same agency, so there's some incentive structure problems there. I just have a question. You were there for about a year, and in the book for Clinton Cash, how we got into USAID stuff is one of the people who paid for speeches for the Clintons and had donated a lot of money to the Clinton Foundation ran a cell phone company that was based out of Jamaica, but they got into Haiti. And they got grants from USAID after the earthquake to help expand mobile phone banking. And then one of the things that we found in the reporting for Clinton Cash is that this cell phone company then goes on to have like record-breaking sales in Haiti. Like no one's doing well in Haiti post-earthquake except this cell phone company while they're paying Bill and Hillary money. So it's a weird story. It's a classic encapsulation of what happened with the Clinton Foundation. But how typical is that, right? I mean, I'm thinking international aid would be rife for stories like that, conflicts of interest. Did you run across that stuff? And do you think it's just the business model is so established that that's why trying to push back against it keeps you from making any headway? Is everyone sort of invested in this?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Yeah, now Mark Green, who was the head of aid when I was there, and I ran this office for a year. I was also there 6 months before this as a senior advisor. So I got to see some things. He was not in the same circles as a Hillary Clinton. Now we now have Samantha Power in there who is in that rarefied sphere. And we have seen cases like this where senior officials seem to find ways to get these great contracts for their friends. And we've also seen, and this Paul Foldy in particular, that these lobbyists going out of their way to inhibit the supervision of these contracts. And I know a number of contracting officers basically were punished because they questioned some of the practices going on. I do also know in the case of Haiti, one of the things that this Inspector General Whistleblower got in trouble for was for complaining about an audio about Haiti that had been doctored and then had been removed from the USAID website. So there are still some aftershocks from the Clinton period going on. And but you have, we'll say the Trump administration made an effort to actually diversify the base of contractors, but they were stymied repeatedly including by people like Bonnie Glick. But basically, there's a small number of contracting organizations that have these incestuous relationships where people from USAID go in and out, and it is very troubling and should be of great concern to taxpayers.
So let's talk about ways we can fix this. And we know there are no easy fixes, right? Because these are massive bureaucracies. There's a lot of money at stake. But we always like to try to give people some hope that there's a reform agenda that we could try to put forward. I think your recommendation about having inspector generals actually separate, so they're not actually employees of the government agencies they're supposed to be monitoring, I think is an excellent idea. What are some of the other things, short of abolishing USAID, which I don't think is going to happen? What are some of the things that could be done to reform it, not just in terms of the corruption and the cronyism, but actually to make it a little bit more effective, right? To where it actually leads to greater prosperity around the world and also advances American interests by doing so.
Yeah. Besides the Inspector General part of it, I think the most important part, certainly in the near term, is getting some good political appointees in there. And so with election coming up, I think we have that opportunity because what I saw was that there were a lot of people there who shouldn't have been political appointees. And in some cases, those people actually resisted those of us who were trying to make the place better and more effective and more efficient. And fortunately, the Heritage Foundation and America First Policy Institute are already working on programs of this sort because they know that we didn't get people. But you have to have people who, number one, know the subject matter because you have to be able to, have some expertise. You're not just relying on bureaucrats. You have to have natural ability, and you have to believe in what the president is trying to achieve, which was, again, a problem we had with a lot of appointees. They weren't really interested. And, people are going to have to take risks. They said there's always a risk of blowback as I encounter, but you have to have people who are not afraid to, ruffle feathers or rock the boat. And, that may, also means people who are not going to be dead set on trying to find a job in the swamp when they leave. Because that is a problem too. A lot of people will try to go along to get along if that's what they want to do, and I think it's you need people who have something else to do besides work in the government or government contracting business after they leave government.
Just, do you think we should keep it as an agency? I mean, do you think that on the whole USAID does a good job, and do we benefit as a country as a result of it?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That was actually one of the big controversies we had in the Trump administration, because the Trump administration stated clearly the purpose of USAID is to advance America's foreign policy interests. Now, under the Obama administration, its purpose had been fighting global poverty, which is
how's that going?
Yes,
in Haiti, it's crushing it. I don't know if you heard, they fixed it.
Yeah. So, but that was an ongoing struggle. I mean, one of the things we saw repeatedly was that the career bureaucrats. And we even had some former Obama appointees who had burrowed their way in. They were doing everything they could to preserve the Obama era programs, and they would oftentimes, reinvent or relabel them to kind of claim they were supporting national interests or they were supporting self-reliance, which was what the Trump administration was saying. We want to promote self-reliance so these countries aren't still depending on us 30 years from now. But yeah, certainly more needs to be done. There are things that the agency can do to promote national interests. Whether they should be part of the State Department has been a matter of dispute. On the theory that makes sense, although having also encountered the State Department, people at the State Department are not good at running things, and when they've been asked to be operational, they do quite poorly. So I'm not sure that's the solution. Another problem you have is that Congress has it has a large aid lobby, and in fact, they resisted efforts to cut the budget by Trump. I think you're still going to see bipartisan support for some kind of USAID. So I don't think it's going to go away, but there are, as I said, ways to make it work. And if we can get a good leadership team in there the next time around, I think it will work.
Well, it's always been a mystery to me why we allow foreign governments and foreign entities to lobby our Congress for our money. I mean, I believe we all have a constitutional right to petition our government, but it's not the Chinese government's government, right? They don't have those constitutional rights. So it's enormously frustrating. I highly recommend this book, Masters of Corruption by Dr. Mark Moyar. He has lived it. He's been on the inside. He was courageous in fighting for it. And I think he gives a lot of good examples of how the deep state works. A lot of people throw around the term. A lot of people, have theories on how it works. This is an actual experience of it. And when you read this book, you're going to feel, number one, anger and frustration. I also felt a little bit of sadness because, clearly, Mark, you went in there. You weren't looking to get some gig, right? Working for some, Beltway bandit that was a USAID contractor. You went in there wanting to try to make a policy difference. And based on your experience, that's going to discourage people. I mean, who wants to go and put up with this crap when all you're trying to do is serve your country? It's discouraging that way, but I really recommend people read the book. I know Eric has read it. Do you have any final thoughts?
My final thoughts are that it's so funny to me that you are always trying to end on a positive note. Let's give people some hope. This is a disaster. You just said, everything you just said is depressing and how it is. Yep. Here's a guy went in, wanted to change it, wasn't trying to get a gig, was actually just trying to save taxpayer money and root out waste, fraud, and abuse. The gang that eats lunch together at the USAID cafeteria is like, no, you can't do that. This is how we do it. And then they started with, he's misusing his computer. Oh, you're parking in the wrong spot. All these silly office-y things. Yeah. And then finally they get him on a book he wrote 2 years ago we'd think might have classified information. But it just shows you how incestuous and how incessant the effort to keep people from the outside of making any real change is. So when you talk about the deep state, this is that. Right.
This is it. And I would just get your comment on this, Dr. Moore. I think the main thing is people hear these stories, they read it, they get discouraged, they get disgusted, and they just want to step away. And the problem is that's what the deep state wants you to do. They want people to be disgusted and step away because that leaves the terrain to them, doesn't it?
Yeah. And so at the end, I do try to focus on what can be done to fix these things. And we've talked about some of them, but certainly the next election will be critical. I think Congress has an important role to play, and I think what your institute does is critical in helping get Congress interested, and also media. If you can get enough people's attention on this, I think there is room for progress. And if Trump wins another term, there'll be great opportunities to go in and start digging into some of these cases because they've been, certainly in my case, hidden all sorts of information from me. Even I've got an ongoing 2-year lawsuit just to get the basic facts out. So if we can get people in there who are committed to the truth and to change, I think we can fix some of these problems. And I also argue that even though there's a lot of badness in government, the way you fix it is to get good people to go into government. And as I said, political appointees, you have the virtue of not going in for your whole career. You can go in, fight some battles and hopefully succeed. But when you finish, you can go out and do something elsewhere. So now I'm a professor of history at Hillsdale College, and I don't have to deal with all the swampness. But I do think it's good for people to spend some time in government if they can.
Well, as Ronald Reagan said, personnel is policy, right? It's one thing to have a president come in and say, here's what we're going to do. You actually have to have the foot soldiers to do it. And there are efforts being undertaken right now to create those foot soldiers if Donald Trump does win in November. Dr. Moyar, we thank you for your courage and your service to our country in so many different ways. And we encourage people to pick up this book. And we look forward to hearing more about the work you're doing in this area.
Yeah, and thanks, Peter, Eric, for shining a light on this case and so many others, because we really need people to understand what's going on.
Well, thank you. And we thank you, the audience, for listening. As always, we know your time is precious. You can find out about our research at thedrilldown.com. You can find my book, Blood Money, at Amazon. You can find Eric's book, Fraud on Electoral Fraud, also on Amazon. And you can find this podcast wherever fine podcasts are located. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.